Okay, hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening, in person and online. My name is Helen Liu and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the Cary Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like today's event to you. We are running this program in a hybrid format, so if you have any questions and you're joining us here today in person, just raise your hand and we'll pass along a mic. If you are online with us today, just put your questions into the Q&A. Maxima Book Center is here tonight for those of you who are interested in purchasing a copy of the book today. Brian is here. Our authors will also be available to sign them after the program. Tonight we will meet the authors of the Ransomware Hunting Team who will talk about their new book. It is my pleasure to introduce them to you now. Renee Dudley is a tech reporter at ProPublica. Before joining ProPublica in 2018, she was a member of the enterprise team at Reuters, where she reported extensively on issues with college entrance exams. She uncovered a U.S. higher education admissions system corrupted by systemic cheating on standardized tests. Following public outcry over the use of leaked SAT exams and other issues Reuters uncovered, the test makers vowed to fix the problems. The series was named a 2017 Pulitzer Prize finalist in national reporting. Journalist and author Daniel Golden is a Boston-based senior editor and reporter at ProPublica. Golden has been instrumental in 3 Pulitzer Prizes, 2 as an editor and 1 as a reporter. He co-edited a ProPublica series on Latin American asylum seekers caught between the U.S. government and the MS-13 gang, which won the 2019 Pulitzer Prize for feature writing. Before joining ProPublica in October 2016, he worked as a managing editor for education and enterprise at Bloomberg News. There he edited a series about tax inversions, companies moving headquarters overseas to avoid taxes that earned Bloomberg's only Pulitzer Prize in 2015. Welcome, Renee and Dan. We are so pleased to have you here today.
Thanks so much for being here tonight. We're delighted to be here and delighted to see those of you here in person, and for the people joining in on Zoom, thanks for being a part of our talk. We're excited to talk about the book tonight, and I thought we'd first start by introducing you to ransomware if you're not already familiar with it. If you're not, you probably will be in the not so distant future because it is the defining cyber scourge of our time. Ransomware is a crime where hackers get into your computer system and they encrypt your files. Everything is locked up. If you try to open a file, you'll see nothing. It'll be encrypted, it'll look like unrecognizable to you. And unless you pay a ransom or unless you have good backups, you have no recourse. You have no way to get them back, except for the ransomware hunting team. The ransomware hunting team is a global band of private researchers who, in their spare time and for free, look for vulnerabilities in the hundreds of strains of ransomware that are out there. And when they find a vulnerability, they create tools that allow people to get their files back without having to pay hackers. Why is this so important? Well, first of all, you want to be able to recover without having to pay. And second of all, among many other reasons, when you don't pay a ransom, you prevent ransomware from proliferating. When you pay a ransom, makes a crime profitable, hackers just keep on going and going and going. So this group of people helps people recover for free. And they're so fascinating because they're everyday people. They have everyday jobs. Some of them didn't graduate from college. Some of them didn't even graduate from high school. And they do this out of a passion for public service, a drive, the intellectual curiosity, the drive to do something that they know that there aren't many people in the world who can do. The internet is their intellectual home, and they don't want bad guys in it. And so tonight we're excited to tell you more about the team, the people who are on it, who do this amazing work, as this public service, and about the whole culture of ransomware and hackers, and the enablers and the people who fight it and the people who help it keep ticking. So I'll kick it over to Dan next.
Yeah, our book focuses on the hunting team, but it also portrays the whole sweep of ransomware from its beginnings, which started, surprisingly enough, with an American inventor of ransomware. I say surprising because most of the ransomware hackers these days are from Russia or the Middle East or Eastern Europe, but the inventor was named Joseph Polk, and he was an American, very well educated. He grew up in Cleveland, went to Ohio State, got a doctorate at Harvard, and was supposed to be the next great primatologist, like Diane Fossey or Jane Goodall or somebody like that. Instead, he went to Africa to do research on baboons, but he became a kind of Indiana Jones adventurer gone bad. Instead of studying baboons, he began dreaming up get-rich-quick schemes. And around a little more than 30 years ago, at the height of the AIDS epidemic, he sent discs to thousands of medical researchers, most of them in Europe, saying, you should read our disc to find out about AIDS education. But when they put the disc in their computer enough times, the computer locked up and a note popped up and said, if you want to use your computer anymore, send $400 to this post office box in Panama. And that was the first instance of ransomware. And Pop was caught and he was arrested and extradited from the US to England, where he pleaded insanity and he did some various bizarre antics, wearing diapers on his head and things like that. And so the judge finally got sick of him, just said, if you leave England, I will never, never come back, we'll let you go. He went back to the US and he actually never did anything more with ransomware. He founded this butterfly conservatory in upstate New York that bears his name. It's the Joseph Polk Butterfly Conservatory. And he was killed in a car accident around the time it started, but if you go there today, you can see a plaque that says, pays tribute to him and calls him a naturalist, evolutionary anthropologist, writer, and brilliant thinker, but it doesn't mention his ransomware legacy. So about 20 years after his ransomware, around 2012 or so, that was when ransomware started to pick up, because cryptocurrency like Bitcoin started to emerge, and that made it easier to collect payments that couldn't be tracked. And then really but at the time then, just like Pop, the early ransomware hackers, they just demanded, they attacked individuals and they just demanded a few $100s. But in more recent years, actually starting around the time Renee and I began working on, studying ransomware 4, 5, 6 years ago, it evolved into attacks on major entities, corporations, hospitals, governments, schools, universities, and demanding hundreds of thousands and then millions and then tens of millions of dollars. And as a result, it's been elevated into a much more serious threat. And probably the best known one was the attack now it's not last year anymore because we're in 2023, so it's in 2021, on the Colonial Pipeline in the eastern US, a very large pipeline that ended up shutting down something like 45% of the gas supplies in the East Coast. And Colonial eventually had to pay the ransom, something north of $4 million. So it's become this huge threat. It's also kind of epitomizes the changing nature of crime, in that in the old days, when before cybercrime, crime was face-to-face. Somebody would commit a crime, you could catch them at the scene if you got there in time. But with crimes like ransomware, that's not the case. These are international crimes where the hackers are often in countries that we don't have extradition treaties with. And they can destroy an American institution and collect the money without ever being somewhere where it's possible for us to catch them. So they've complicated crime more broadly, as well as posing a threat to individual entities. And so now a new kind of crime like that requires sort of a new kind of crime fighter, and that's where the hunting team comes in. And that I'll throw it back to Renee.
So like Dan mentioned, we started looking at ransomware in 2018. We were both fairly new to ProPublica then, and I was hearing that ransomware was, increasingly hitting big companies. There was around mid-2018, the summer of 2018, there was some of the first six-figure ransom payments, which now looks like small change, but now it was tens of millions of dollars ransoms. But then it was like, oh my gosh, $600,000 ransom, $500,000 ransom. This is a big deal. And so we started looking into ransomware, and as I was digging into it, people started telling me, you have to talk to this guy, Demon Slay 335, that's his online handle. People don't really know his real name, but he's the foremost expert on ransomware. There wasn't a whole lot about this guy online, but I did track him down to his Nerds on Call IT repair shop in the town of Normal, Illinois. And I started chatting with them. And as the story started rolling out for ProPublica about the entire ransomware landscape and the enablers that make it go round, Michael was really influential in helping. Demon Slay 335, Michael Gillespie, the hero of our book, was really influential in helping me understand the landscape. And as I went on in the reporting, I learned that he was a part of this global team, the ransomware hunter team, who helps people recover without having to pay. And so I went to go visit Michael, just as part of the reporting. I knew he could help me understand more about how things work, and I was interested in his team. And when I got to his house in rural Illinois, I was really blown away by his circumstances, because by this point I knew that this ransomware hunting team was helping millions and millions of people helping millions of people, preventing them from paying billions of dollars to hackers. And here he is in his pretty rundown house, greeting me from the front porch, surrounded by his 8 cats and his rabbit and his dog, and just a completely humble guy. And what was so surprising was that usually when somebody's the best in the world at what they do, they've got an entourage, handlers, and schedulers and spokespeople. And it's unusual to see somebody who's just this guy in his house doing this work in his spare time. His regular job, he's fixing broken hard drives in people's digital cameras, and in his spare time he's saving people from paying money to serious criminals. And we got talking about his life and his experience, the fact that he'd grown up in poverty. His parents filed for bankruptcy. He bounced around to different houses when his parents he couldn't pay for their own home, and he overcame cancer. He had all of these extraordinary circumstances, and he's doing this not for fame or for money or for any of the typical motivations that people have for for this sort of ambition and success at what they do. And as I learned more about, after this encounter, Dan and I discussed it, and I called Dan from the airport on my way home to Boston and said, this guy's really interesting. I think we should do a profile on him. And that was sort of the beginning of the reporting on the ransomware hunting team, and subsequently the book. And as we reported on the team itself, we come to find all of these people have fascinating life stories. The second, other than Michael Gillespie, the second foremost code breaker on the team is a guy named Fabian Wosar, who grew up in Germany and subsequently fled to England because he was afraid of, he was paranoid about hackers tracking him down, and he wanted to be in a place where there were greater privacy laws. So many of them had backgrounds of poverty and abuse, and that's part of what motivated them to fight back against these hackers. And it's interesting too, as we went along, we found that there were similarities not only among members of the ransomware hunting team, but between the hunting team members and their foes, the hackers, because all of these people have similar skills. One's using it for good, one is using it for evil, but they're experts in the field of cryptography. The hackers are motivated by money, and the hunters are motivated by this desire to help people, but the skills are the same. And we found other similarities too. One strain of ransomware is called Hakuna Matata ransomware, and a couple members of the hunting team, their favorite movie is The Lion King. They enjoy video games. They have similar taste in movies, and it's just, we thought it was really interesting that they have they're sort of kindred spirits in that regard, but they're obviously using their skills for different motives. On the other end, there's hackers who I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but there are hackers who there's increasing evidence that some of them are tied to foreign regimes that are hostile to the West. One hacker that is interesting to talk about is named Maxim Mikubits. And this is somebody who has been proven to be connected to the FSB. And he runs a ransomware gang aptly named Evil Corp that's wreaked havoc on the West and taken down major businesses, household name companies. And this is somebody who feels so confident in his safety where he is in Moscow that he drives around Moscow in a Lamborghini with a license plate that translates to thief. So it shows how there's the hackers themselves, run from people who are doing it for money to make a living, all the way to people connected possibly to the Putin regime, certainly North Korea and Iran. And it just shows the escalating stakes of what we're dealing with and how important the hunting team is to stopping the threat.
So the hunting team can't always crack the ransomware. It can only crack it if there's a mistake in the code. And cryptography is a complicated business, and often the hackers do have a mistake, and that's where the hunting team recognizes it and takes advantage. But if it's done perfectly, there's really very little they can do. And so it creates this sort of long time dilemma for the victim to pay or not to pay, which was always a dilemma even in the days of traditional kidnapping for ransom. Do we pay the ransom or not? Obviously, the argument against paying is you reward the criminals, you incentivize more attacks, it's bad for society, but the repercussions can be terrible for people who don't refuse to pay the ransom. And so, it can be anything from a business may have to shut down because it can't recover its files. A university may not be able to offer courses, particularly online courses, and medical care can be extremely compromised. So in our book, we look at some of the victims of ransomware, some whom the hunting team bailed out, and some whom they couldn't. And so, for example, there was a couple in Oregon that the husband had a brain tumor. He was about to start radiation and chemo at his local hospital there in rural Oregon, and the hospital was hit by ransomware. It had no access to any electronic records or files or diagnostic equipment, and his wife had to drive him 140 miles round trip, every day to the next nearest hospital for his treatment, making a already agonizing ordeal even worse. There's even been deaths attributed to ransomware. There was a case in an Alabama hospital where The hospital had been hit by ransomware, and a woman who was about to have a baby, and because the ransomware had crippled the systems there, the medical personnel didn't realize that the fetus was having complications, and the baby was born very brain damaged and died soon after. And in the book, we talk about another victim, which was the city of Baltimore, which was attacked in 2019 by ransomware, probably from Turkey. It's not exactly clear where. And where the mayor faced this decision of do we pay the ransom or don't we pay the ransom? What's best for the city? What's best morally? And I want to read you a little excerpt from the part about where the mayor his experience. He was, as often in these cases, he was a brand new mayor, and they seem to often attack cities where the officials have just taken over and don't have a lot of experience. Just switch to my reading glasses here. This is from a chapter called Shaking Down a City. On the morning of Tuesday, May 7th, 2019, Bernard Jack Young was eagerly anticipating the crowning moment of his career. 2 days later, he would be inaugurated for a job that he had once coveted, but that he'd almost given up wishing for, mayor of Baltimore. But when he logged onto his phone and city-issued laptop, something was missing. Normally, he was deluged with emails, but he hadn't received any new messages overnight, and he couldn't send any either. Shortly after 7 a.m., he called the city's chief information officer, Frank Johnson. "Something's wrong with the system," Jack told Frank. "You need to check it out." Frank's staff was already checking. Baltimore's elected officials and employees had been complaining since shortly before midnight that they couldn't open their city emails and files. Around 5 a.m., a technician looked into their complaints but couldn't access the system remotely. At first, the problem was thought to be a power outage or networking issue, easily fixable. But an engineer dispatched to the city's data center on Lexington Street couldn't log in. Even the break glass access codes, named after the method of pulling a fire alarm in an emergency, didn't work. Jack headed to his City Hall office where Frank called him around 9 a.m. "Mr. Mayor, I just want to inform you that our system has been compromised by ransomware," Frank said, "and they're asking for a ransom." Jack's first reaction was optimism. We can fix this, he thought. But the more he looked into it, the more downcast he became. Although its 9/11 system had been hit by ransomware the year before, Baltimore had no formal plan for responding to a cyber disaster. "I finally figured out that we had an antiquated system that wasn't prepared for this kind of attack." A note from the intruders began popping up on employees' screens. "Your network targeted by Robinhood ransomware," it read. "We're watching you for days, and we've worked on your systems to gain full access to your company and bypass all of your protections. We won't talk more. All we know is money." The gang demanded 13 Bitcoin, about $75,000 at the time, within 4 days. Then the price would rise $10,000 per day. The ransomware knocked the city's print shop offline, thwarting arrangements for Jack's inauguration. A contractor had to be hired to print the programs. But that was the least of the new mayor's problems. The attack brought much of his government to a standstill. It stymied a wide array of public services and revenue sources, from parking tickets to water bills, in addition to private business deals such as home sales that required city approval or records. Instead of hosting a reception after the inauguration, as he'd expected to do, Jack went straight to work. "I was like, why me? Why did this happen when I became mayor?" he recalled. "Not that I wanted it to happen to anyone, but it was something that, honest to God, I had sleepless nights. The attack was the thing that worried me the most, even with the shootings and murders and everything going on." Now, Jack ended up making a very courageous decision. He decided not to pay the $75,000 ransom. And, eventually the city recovered. But it took a long time. Some of the services were down for months. The city ultimately ended up spending about $18 million to recover. And, people were frustrated by the slow pace. And when he ran for re-election, he got 6% of the vote. So it's a bit of a cautionary tale. And, but yet it was an admirable thing for him to do, I think. And, you hope other public officials have that same courage. Renee will speak about one of our government agencies and its efforts against ransomware.
So, ransomware has exploded in recent years. Like we talked about, tens of millions of dollars per ransom, all of the biggest companies, healthcare systems, you name it. And when we looked at how did things get so bad, one of the areas that we looked at was the US government response to ransomware. And I think it's helpful to put things into perspective when it comes to the complaints about ransomware that come into the US government. So Michael Gillespie has a website called ID Ransomware, which he started as a part of his work on the team. People can upload a sample encrypted file and see if there's a free decryptor for it. And submissions to his site number in the few thousands a day, up to 3,000, 4,000 a day. By contrast, the FBI gets 2,000 complaints of ransomware in an entire year. And we know that it's much, much more prevalent than that. But the thought among victims of ransomware is, I know the FBI is not going to do anything. And so we looked at, and this is a common refrain that you hear from people, and the reasons for that, there's a number of reasons for that, but one of the most commonly cited is they know that the FBI is not going to do anything. So we looked at the historical FBI and why the FBI has ignored this problem for so long. And really, it goes back to the Hoover days. It goes back to the culture of the FBI itself. The FBI is a place that expects agents to be able to do any job, anywhere. And that works if you are an agent investigating bank robberies and they want you to work on white-collar crime. It doesn't work as well when you're a gang agent and they want you to go do cybercrime because there's such a steep learning curve. The people who are great at investigating cybercrime are the people with a background in computer science or people who have been studying computers all their lives, sort of like the ransomware hunting team. Its members were enamored with computers since they were kids. And the FBI is filled with agents, computer division agents who really don't have the either interest or aptitude in computers that's necessary to investigate this type of crime. About a dozen agents came to then Director James Comey in 2015 to complain about this very issue. This was right as ransomware was taking hold. Bitcoin had been established to allow payments to be as anonymous as possible. And these agents were concerned about the proliferation of ransomware and other cyber crimes that were taking off. And their colleagues who handled traditional crime viewed them as lesser than. They were the geek squad in this sea of jocks. The FBI is a very, very macho place, and their skills were viewed by virtually everyone as less important than other people and other people's skills in the bureau. And so any type of cybercrime just really couldn't get traction, but ransomware in particular was seen as not the problem of the FBI. At the time, ransoms were not high enough to get the interest of the Justice Department, but more importantly, in the FBI, prestige springs from being a successful, what they call trial agent, somebody who's going to get an arrest that will make the nightly news and make everybody look good. And that just doesn't happen as often in ransomware. They're difficult crimes to investigate. As Dan mentioned earlier, the hackers are usually abroad, sometimes in countries that are hostile to the US that lack extradition treaties. So the agents saw, what's in it for me to go after ransomware. And the crimes exploded. Now they're behind the curve. It's become a very challenging situation. And so you may be thinking, well, what are they supposed to do if there's all these challenges? It's useful to contrast the FBI with the National Law Enforcement Agency that's done a really great job at this internationally, which is the Dutch National Police. The Dutch National Police is known as the gold standard when it comes to investigating cybercrime in general, but ransomware in specific. And you look at the reasons why they have had so much success. And a lot of it comes down to the priority that they place on elevating computer scientists, as seeing computer scientists culturally as important as everybody else who's investigating traditional crime. And what they've done is they've paired computer scientists with traditional law enforcement officers so that one person knows the ins and outs of what's being investigated and one person can, knows how to run the case, interrogate a suspect and things like that. And when you look at what's happening in the FBI, the ratio for a computer scientist, computer science expert to the traditional law enforcement personnel is they're so severely outnumbered. There's something like 1 for every 10 or 20 agents, 1 computer scientist for every 10 to 20 traditional agents in the cyber division squad, which is really just not enough. The people who they do have are seen as agent helpers. Their skills are not appreciated, and they've spoken out about it. And since the colonial attack that shut down the gas pipeline a couple of years ago, the FBI has sort of reoriented, and now ransomware is put on the same priority level as terrorism. FBI Director Chris Wray even compared ransomware to the attacks of 9/11. So it's now seen as a big priority, but they're so far behind the curve that it's difficult to catch up. And we see attacks continue every day. What the Dutch police has done that the FBI is starting to move towards is, instead of focusing on just arrests, they're putting more of a priority on things like disrupting hacker infrastructure, taking down the servers that they use to commit their crimes, going after the money launderers who take care of laundering the Bitcoin and some of the ancillary services. But those are the services that are needed to make the hacker successful. So if you can't get Maxim Yakubits because he's in Moscow and his father-in-law is good friends with Putin, you could go after the people that they use to carry out the attacks, who may be based in other countries. There was one well-publicized arrest of a Canadian man. You can go after take down the servers that they're using to do these crimes, which are often located in places like the Netherlands or France, because they're faster and lucrative for the hackers to set up shop there from a cost perspective, and some of these other sort of lower hanging fruit that actually does stop the hackers in their tracks. And I think I'll read a section that has to do with Michael Gillespie's work with the FBI. The FBI wants its agents to be athletic college graduates with relevant job experience who are willing to move around the country as needed. So Michael, who didn't go to college and never left his hometown and self-admittedly is not very athletic, would never make the cut as an agent, but the FBI really needed his help, so they made him an informant. So this is from a chapter called The G-Man and the Dolphin. It was the kind of overture that Michael Gillespie had been half expecting after the immediate success of ID ransomware. But he was still taken aback in 2016 when an FBI agent named Mark Phelps asked to meet with him. Michael didn't feel he could refuse, but he explained that he was overwhelmed with work at Nerds on Call and with the ransomware hunting team, and Mark would have to accommodate his schedule. They chose a time after the end of Michael's workday and decided to meet at a Panera Bread restaurant 500 feet from his office. On the night of the meeting, as he crossed the 5 lanes of traffic that separated Nerds on Call's strip mall parking lot from Panera's, Michael became nervous. He hadn't considered the significance of talking with the FBI and realized he didn't know what to expect. He grew paranoid, as though the purpose of the meeting were to arrest him for some unknown crime. It was the same feeling he had whenever he drove past a police car, a wave of anxiety, even though he knew he wasn't violating any law. Mark and another FBI employee, Justin Harris, greeted him at the restaurant. They told him they were paying for his meal, but with little appetite and afraid to upset the FBI by overspending, he only ordered an apple. When the trio sat down, Mark explained the reason for the meeting. He was a cyber agent and Justin was a computer scientist. They had come across Michael's website and they wanted to know what information he might have that could help the FBI investigate ransomware. Michael was relieved to hear that they planned to tap his expertise, not nail him for some inadvertent offense. Mark and Justin asked if Michael's analysis of information he gathered on ID ransomware could help identify attackers. Michael knew hackers worked hard to cover their tracks, but he also believed he could, in some cases, identify the IP addresses of their servers. He told them that if he could help, he would. As they wrapped up their discussion, Mark asked to meet again. Dazzled by the prospect of working with the FBI and humbled that they had sought him out, Michael agreed. A short time later, he signed on to become an FBI informant. The Bureau gave him a secret code name to be used on official documents that could end up in court. All Michael will say about the alias is that it's very fitting. Whenever he signed his code name, he guarded his privacy by disguising his handwriting.
I'll say a few words about sort of the present and future of ransomware. One of the biggest concerns is that the quality of the ransomware, the coding quality, is getting better. And a paradox that we allude to in the book is that this is partly due to the ransomware hunting team. And the reason is that, you know, when the team cracks a code and it notifies the victims, here's your key to unlock your files, you don't have to pay, they don't pay. And then the hackers eventually recognize, hey, wait a minute, nobody's paying us, the money's not coming in, something must be wrong with our coding. So then they go through and they fix the code and they make it unbreakable. So the ability of the hunting team and other people like them to crack codes, they function as kind of product testers in a strange way for the ransomware groups. And in the long run, ransomware improves. And so that's one source of, you know, increasing concern for the future, because as I said, if it's, you know, if they do it right, it's unbreakable, and they're doing it right more and more often. The other issue is that why ransomware is getting scarier, as Renee alluded to, is the increasingly clear connection with some foreign governments. I mean, it's being sponsored by these governments and evolving from kind of a get-rich-quick scheme for hackers to a tool that these nation states wield to harm their adversaries. I mean, it's become sort of the most significant, in a way, criminal threat to global security, and the tide of regimes kind of became clear to everybody in 2021, when ransomware was at the top of the agenda for a meeting between Putin and Joe Biden, and then in a follow-up phone call. And you may recall, you know, Joe Biden urged Putin to crack down on the ransomware groups that were operating in Russia against American targets. And it was very clear that Putin could do that if he wanted. And he arrested a few token hackers, apparently in the hope that the US would reciprocate by looking the other way when Russia invaded Ukraine. But as you know, we didn't look the other way. We supplied arms to Ukraine. And Putin then stopped harassing the ransomware gangs and began recruiting them for his war effort, or his, quote, special military operation, unquote. And then, whatever their political views, that the hackers in Russia and other countries presumably fear that if they don't cooperate with Putin and his ilk, they'll be put out of business or imprisoned or handed over to the Western enforcement for diplomatic advantage. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, one of the most devastating ransomware gangs, Conti, announced its, quote, full support of Russian government, unquote, and said that it would use its, quote, full capacity to deliver retaliatory measures in case the Western warmongers attempt to target critical infrastructure in Russia or any Russian-speaking region of the world. And as time has gone on since then, we've seen more and more evidence of this kind of alliance and of ransomware gangs being, brought into the Russian war effort. And, the possibilities there are, very concerning. But, there are some few hopeful signs. I think Renee wants to speak a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think people are realizing that this has to be taken seriously. We have Chris Wray of the FBI comparing ransomware to the 9/11 attacks. But on the nation state side of things, one of the concerning twists and what's making people really wake up to this threat is that ransomware is being increasingly used from for an intelligence gathering standpoint. Before in the earlier days of ransomware, hackers would encrypt files, lock them up, pay me to unlock them, okay, you've got it back. But these days, and this is a trend that started a couple of years ago, hackers are stealing data before they encrypt it. And that data could be anything. It could be intellectual property, it could be state secrets, it could be health records, it could be anything. And when you think about who's behind some of these attacks, it's very alarming to think about how that data may be used. And ransomware, which has been seen as kind of, these are scummy criminals, this isn't, these aren't the most brilliant people doing this stuff, that's been the historical perspective on who's behind it. When you think about who's behind it these days, North Korea, Iran, Russia, you start to really worry about what kind of information that they're stealing. So positive signs are, for one, the hunting team has sort of been ignored by the US government historically. They've tapped Michael's expertise, but they haven't really leveraged the full capabilities of the team. The tools that they haven't publicized to victims, even when they've existed. That's beginning to change. We're seeing closer cooperation between the US government and the ransomware hunting team specifically. The tools that they are creating, the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI is quietly telling victims about. They don't make a big deal publicizing it because they don't want to tip off the hackers, and then the hackers will go fix the ransomware. But when victims come forward, they quietly tell them this tool is available. And in return, that's making more victims want to actually go to the US government to say, I've been hacked. The numbers aren't in yet since all of this cooperation has started, but every indication is that there's now more complaints coming into the FBI, which is actually a good thing. It reflects the reality. And when people come to the government can do a better job of investigating. So there are hopeful signs for progress from the federal standpoint. And all of this is great for the hunting team too, because it gets their tools to the people who need it the most.
Why don't we take some questions?
Sure. So it's probably a hard number to get, but do you have a feeling for how many of these actually get reported? Obviously, it's not in the best interest of particularly an institution like a financial institution or a hospital to say, hey, we got hacked. It was probably pretty tempting to say, hey, why don't we pay them off? We don't want to have our customers lose faith. So it's probably a hard number to get. Do you have a feeling for how many actually get reported and how many people just go ahead and pay the ransom?
Well, Renee may be able to speak to this better, but as she was saying, a very small percentage get reported to the FBI, And then in addition, there's been issues with public companies not reporting to the SEC because they don't want to acknowledge to their, shareholders, investors, that their cybersecurity was lax and they got, hit by ransomware. Even when they do report it, they don't usually use the word ransomware. They'll say, malware incident or something like that. So there's a lot of lack of reporting there, though the SEC, I believe, has, stiffened up its reporting requirements in this regard. But Renee might be able to speak more.
Yeah, nobody wants to admit that they've been hit, right? Because it's a way of saying, I haven't shored up my defenses well enough. So this has been one of the historical problems. There has not been enough reports. It looks like less of a problem than it actually is. Michael Gillespie's site has as many complaints in one day as the FBI does in an entire year. And by sort of understating the problem, nobody can really get a grip on how widespread it is. One of the strange and interesting data points is actually from the insurance industry. As ransomware has taken off, people have flooded to insurers to get cyber insurance. It's a lot of businesses, small, medium, and large, feel that it's necessary to have it. And it's interesting though, because it's not like auto accidents or arson or fire where there's years of reliable data. Insurers are sort of starting from scratch and building their actuarial data. And it had been, when a few years ago, when I was reporting on ransomware for ProPublica, years before the book, we did this story about how insurers were part of the enablers of ransomware because they were so willing to pay out ransoms left and right. And the story, I talked to one of a spokesperson from the National Insurance Association, and we were discussing how they were so willing to pay out, but what happens when the ransomware attackers realize, if I hit an insured company, that basically means an automatic payout. And they said, well, it's sort of like, auto insurance fraud. If we have a sense that somebody set their car on fire, sometimes it's easier just to pay out the claim rather than get the police involved, do a full investigation. You do the cost benefit analysis, just pay it. But as during the course of our conversation, the wheels were sort of turning, and you can't do that all too much because then people find out about it, and then you end up paying all these fraudulent claims. And the chances are that the same thing could happen with ransomware. Hackers find out that we're paying out claims, and they're just gonna keep hitting us and keep hitting us and keep hitting us. Well, that fear came to bear. That's exactly what's happened. Ransomware attackers go in and root around systems. They search for the word ransomware, insurance. They find your policy, and then they peg their demand to the claim limits, to the policy limits. And this is a documented phenomenon. It's gotten to the point that insurers are reversing course. In some cases, policies will no longer cover ransom payments because of this very thing. Premiums are going up, and they're sort of paying for years of just paying out the ransom because it was the expedient thing to do. It was a safer option than the unexpected costs that are associated with recovering from backups.
Yes. Mike?
So they can hear you online.
Thank you. Having gained all this specialized knowledge doing the research, writing this book, do you have any specific suggestions, do's and don'ts to vulnerable public, rather than after the fact trying to find these experts out there who's willing to help us.
Well, you've made a very good point, that prevention is your best course.
Yes.
And the things that the team talks about that are sort of the best practices are, you want to make sure that if you are hit, that you can recover yourself. And for home users, that looks like having reliable backups of your computer that you store on a device that's not connected to the internet, like an external hard drive, and keeping that backed up on a regular basis, weekly or every other week or something like that. In terms of prevention, hackers are very clever at crafting these phishing emails, making emails that look like they really are intended for you. You might be expecting an email from somebody. They make it look like it's really intended for you. Maybe it's coming from your boss or a friend of yours, and then you'll open it up and you'll click on an attachment that you were expecting to be maybe a family photo, but it's ransomware. So looking at if something seems suspicious, looking at the sender's name and making sure it's really who you think it's coming from before you open an attachment. The other thing that they talk about a lot is multi-factor authentication on your on all of your different accounts, your banking accounts and your email and everything. And that looks like not just a password, but a password plus a text that prompts you to enter a 6-digit code or something like that. Those are some of the ways that you can keep yourself safe.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing I'd say is you make a good point, partly because if you look at these attacks, so many of them are on, schools and hospitals, sort of nonprofit organizations, public agencies, and that's partly because those sectors probably don't invest in cutting-edge cybersecurity the way, say, a major bank would. And so, the hackers are looking for places and people where they can get the most money with the easiest entry. So it's the level of cybersecurity is important.
When you mention email, you also want to include text messages as well, correct?
Well, there's certainly spam and other types of cyber scams that can come through text messages. That's not the biggest place for ransomware attacks.
Big attachments.
We have a question online. Will this encourage more institutions to have offline systems for sensitive data such that data has to be moved by hand if it could be used on the internet? Hard to imagine the research you did for the book, which is fascinating. Thank you.
If I understand the question correctly, I mean, certainly offline backups are important, and that's sort of what we were talking about earlier with, for home users, that might look like a device, an external hard drive not connected to the internet. For big companies, we've seen plenty of examples where their cloud backups have also been encrypted. You want cloud backups. That's great to have those backups, but you have to make sure that they're totally safe too. I remember somebody saying, if your senior most information security professional in your company can access it with one click, so can a hacker. So having multi-factor authentication and making sure that those cloud backups are safe too is certainly important.
So you mentioned that the ransomware hunting team did a lot of work on decrypting encrypted files and whatnot. Do they also do a lot of work on the attribution, finding the source, or analyzing the techniques of the ransomware groups? Was that their focus? Do they do a lot of that as well?
So they don't do as much of that, but that said, there are members of the team that's their primary focus. One guy in particular is named Daniel Gallagher, and he's an IT worker based in North Carolina, and his role on the team, they call him the rabbit hole hunter, because he's obsessed with tracking hackers down and punishing them. And so there was a case where he had tracked down, tracked a particular ransomware type down to a German teenager who was working with his friends to do, this pretty low-level ransomware, but still it was hitting people. And he publicly shamed him on Twitter. That's his MO. He called him out. He called him out by his first name. He actually got the man's name, David. And he said the hacker on Twitter, he wasn't expecting anybody to have found out his name. And so he was really taken aback when Daniel called him David online. And so privately, Daniel messaged David and said, you got the skills. You wouldn't have had success in generating ransoms if you didn't. Use those skills to do what we do. You could be saving people from ransomware rather than hitting them with ransomware. And the kid went dark. Well, a few years later, Daniel, the hunting team member, saw this guy's screen name in a weekly list of shout outs on this computer help site that they all congregate at. And in fact, he had flipped him. This guy went from doing ransomware to helping people with ransomware. So that's an example of the hunting team tracking someone down. They do look at the various ways that hackers get in, but that's as more or less a way of helping their own research and in learning what they how they're getting in, so they can figure out how to crack it. And they leave the rest of the attribution to law enforcement.
The example that Renee gives also speaks to what's a large part of our book, which is kind of the banter between the hackers and the hunting team. There's a lot of back and forth, even though they may not know the real identity of the hacker under the person's online alias and under their own alias. They're constantly, and have been teasing and taunting each other. And the hackers might say, "Come on over to our side. You'll make more money in a day than you make in years at your job." And after all, the hunting team doesn't take any money for its services. It's all free. So they say, you suckers, why are you doing this for free? You could come over to our side and make a lot of money. And the hunting team will say back, "Well, at least we don't have to worry about the cops knocking down our door," whatever. There's a lot of banter and joking and kind of a underlying, as Renee said, similarity and maybe even kind of a sneaking respect, that the hackers have for the hunting team.
One more question, maybe follow up to that, is how come more members, or at this stage, why aren't all the members of the team doing highly paid consulting for cybersecurity firms or government agencies or other people that are involved in the fight against ransomware? FBI.
Well, Renee can also speak to this, but partly they do have day jobs, and many of them work in cybersecurity, so they are in that field. And then, of course, their ransomware work takes up an awful lot of their time and effort and energy. It's really their priority, rather than, in a way, whatever their day job is, so that if they took another job, they might have to, reduce their ransomware work. But also it reflects the fact that while we think highly of them and have kind of highlighted their work, there's been a kind of, resistance in the ordinary, bureaucratic institutional world to realizing how important these guys really are. As Renee said, the FBI or others might look at them and say, well, the FBI we don't really want to get in the business of cracking the ransomware. That's a whole nother thing. We just want to catch the people. Or employers might say, well, this guy never even went to college. We want an Ivy League graduate. So there's various reasons why, and they're not maybe driven by ambition. Like Michael, in that sense, like Michael Gillespie, he could have gone to work. He was, from Illinois and living there, and all his relatives wanted him to go work for one of the insurance companies there, and he could have made a lot more money. But he's like, I don't want to be in the middle of a bureaucracy and have to punch in and punch out. I want to be, a sleuth, working at home in my, at my leisure, in my way to save these people. And that's not necessarily something that goes well with a corporate job.
Yeah, and I'll also say, society in general, big tech in general, doesn't necessarily, while it may value their skills and their expertise and their tech chops, it doesn't necessarily value what they have as a product. When you look at what they're developing, it's hundreds of tools that have saved millions of people from paying billions to hackers. Could a company charge for that when they've set a precedent of making it free? Probably not. And what money is there in it for the big tech companies or the big cybersecurity companies to develop free tools for victims, even when they're big victims? I mean, it's one of these things where what's the monetary value of the product that they're creating? Now, all of that said, after the ProPublica profile ran, Michael did get a nicer job. He's not working at Nerds on Call anymore. He's working at a firm that actually negotiates, its bread and butter is negotiating ransom payments, for victims who've been hit with ransomware that the team cannot crack. And what Michael does for this company is, when people have no other choice and they have to pay, a lot of times the tool that they get in exchange for payment, the tool that they get from the hackers, it's filled with bugs, it's really slow, it's difficult to use, you're worried that it too is infected. Michael goes through, cleans that up, makes it pristine, makes sure it's safe, makes it quick and easy and bug-free. And he's making a lot more than he used to.
Well, that's all the time we have this evening. So I'd like to thank Renee and Dan for coming in and sharing their fascinating story with us. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much, and we'll be glad to sign books if you're interested in buying them.
Thank you, George.